public policy group for inviting Dr. Shivshanker Menon and for carefully following up with him. A speaker like him does not require much of an introduction, but for many of our young students, he has been an IFS officer for most of his career. He has served in very senior positions such as the Foreign Secretary of India and was a National Security Advisor during UPA 2. Apart from his professional engagements, he speaks very frequently in the media and in academic forums on various questions connected to foreign policy, diplomacy, atomic energy, and essentially a range of issues which many law students can also learn from. So for this talk, we requested him to largely address discussions that he has dealt with, ideas that he has dealt with in his most recent book, which was published by Penguin last year, which is called Choices Inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy. And we felt that for someone who has just recently been an insider in the system, we would get to learn a lot from him in terms of how these decisions are made, both in a short-term context and in a long-term context. So without wasting much of your time, I would request Dr. Menon to take over the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm not a doctor. I registered for a PhD, and in fact I thought I had a brilliant topic, but then I got sidetracked. I wanted to see China, and in those days there were two ways you could see China in the late 60s.
Easier if you remove this.
Yeah, please. You could either go to China, you could either become a Maoist revolutionary, go underground, or you could do the exam, become a diplomat and go and see China. And I chose the easy way. I thought I'll go, I'll be a diplomat, I'll see China, come back, finish my PhD. I never went back. I mean, it was so, thank you for the doctorate also. But I thought that I would actually speak to you about, Indian foreign policy sort of challenges and opportunities and where we are today, and try and leave as much time as possible to hear you and to maybe have a discussion after that. Ernest May, who wrote what is probably the definitive book on the uses of history for policymakers, used to say there are only three questions that you have to ask in policy making. One, what is the situation? Two, does it matter? Or how does it matter? To what extent does it matter? And three, what do you do about it? And so what I'll try and do is maybe try and say what the situation is that we face as India today, what matters in this, because not everything matters, and what we should be doing, and then maybe throw it open to a discussion. We have a really complicated geopolitical environment today. It's got much worse, actually. There's much more uncertainty than there was before. And it has good, it has bad, it has ugly elements. I mean, it's got it all. We often, I think the problem is that in our public discourse, especially on television, newspapers and so on, we have this threat inflation which dominates. We forget the good part of what is actually around us. Because if you look at it globally, conflict is at historic lows. The actual number of deaths from conflict has steadily gone down. Displaced persons from internal conflict has actually gone up and has for the first time last year reached levels that it was at just after World War II. But that's internally and externally displaced people, refugees, but not the deaths from conflict or the actual risk from terrorists, despite all that you hear about it, is actually very low. The chances of any one of us ever being involved in any terrorist incident are really infinitesimal. And if you look at the numbers in India especially, for the last 15 years, the numbers of deaths from terrorism, of civilians, of security forces, and of terrorists themselves have actually declined steadily, right through. We face no existential threat to India. This is very different from the 50s and 60s when we actually were nervous about what would happen, whether this country would hold together or not. And the world has actually never known a time when so many people were wealthy, were so healthy, were better educated, and where this was less, concentrated and more spread around, then the risk of war among major powers is low. We keep forgetting all this, because if you just listen to TV and read the newspapers, it's enough to frighten the wits out of you of what's going on around the world. And we actually have the means, thanks to science, to actually deal with most of our problems, whether it's hunger, whether it's disease, whether it's illiteracy. You have the technologies, you have the means. Our problems, just like India's problems, South Asia's problems, global problems, are our political inability to actually do the things we know we should do, to use technologies to their full potential for good, to actually deal with the issues that we have. So none of this is to say that there's no negative factors. So when you actually look at the negative factors, you start seeing how it's really the geopolitics and the failure of internal politics also that actually is the main sources of worry, and that have led to this great increase in uncertainty in the international system in the last few years. If you have to start listing them, look at India-China relations, for instance. They're headed for trouble. For 30 years, we had a working modus vivendi, which was formalized during Rajiv Gandhi's December 1988 visit, which was, okay, we have big differences. We have the world's biggest boundary dispute. We'll discuss that, but we won't change the status quo by force. We'll both keep it going. And in the meantime, we'll develop relations where we can. Trade, travel. We brought trade from $2 billion to $73 billion. 13,000 Indians study in China today. And we'll cooperate where we can internationally, whether it was WTO, Doha round, whether it was climate change, and so on. But that modus vivendi is broken down. It's no longer enough to cope with the relationship today. If you look at it, the signs of stress are everywhere, whether it's Masood Azhar's listing, NSG membership. You see now in Doklam, where the old understanding, the Chinese trying to change the status quo by building a road. Now the understanding was based on no changes in the status quo. So and why has it changed? Because China has changed, her behavior has changed. We have changed. Our definition of our own interests has also grown, just as China's has grown. And the world around us has changed. I mean, I'll give you an example. When we started reforms in 91, a little less than 18% of our GDP was external merchandise trade, and most of it went west. By 2014, 49.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. That's almost half. And in that year, it was actually more than the same proportion for China, which was around 42%. Since then, it's dropped. And more than half of it now goes east through the South China Sea. So freedom of navigation in the South China Sea today matters for us. It's an interest that affects us directly. It didn't in 1991. But in 1991, China wasn't claiming the South China Sea either. Her first letter to the UN with that 9-dot line which claims all of the sea as her territorial waters was in 1996. And today she has the means, thanks to development, 30 years of 10% or a little less than 10% growth, she has the means to try and enforce it. And she's doing it. We also have the means to send our Navy there, which we couldn't have done. So in a sense, both our definitions of our interests have expanded, and we're rubbing up against each other in the periphery that we share. Our periphery is theirs, their periphery is ours. And we are going to rub up against each other as we need this to keep developing and growing. Secondly, you look at the US role, and it's not only Trump, it's also Obama too. The US is steadily disengaging from the world, and under Trump, she certainly is no longer interested in maintaining external balances or in supporting a global order. She's much more transactional. She wants other people to run their own affairs. She's in it for what she can get out of it, rather than, so for a lot of things on which we used to rely implicitly on the US, whether it's maritime security across the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, Western Pacific, things that the US Navy used to provide, you can no longer rely on that. Also because there's China-US contention, and that's the other problem. While they have a level of codependency which is unprecedented, in history between any two powers, not even Germany, Britain before World War I, but they also have strategic contention going on today, and it's getting fiercer and fiercer. So you look at Pakistan, for instance, that's also got much worse from 2 points of view. One is the Chinese dependence on Pakistan. As China reaches out to the rest of the world, her uses of Pakistan's utility to China has gone up tremendously. And you can see it in the CPEC, which is a long-term bet, and a Chinese presence in what we think is Indian territory in Jammu and Kashmir, and in Gwadar at the top of the Arabian Sea, which again changes the whole strategic picture. The other problem is that, frankly, after all these years, it's very hard to believe that Pakistan's internal condition will ever develop or change enough that she will stop cross-border terrorism or being a source of radicalism, etc. It's very difficult to today be optimistic. You might have been 20 years ago. There might have been elements of change in Pakistan which you could identify. Today, frankly, it's almost impossible. So for both these reasons, the prospect, at least, for India-Pakistan relations is hardly good. In fact, it's pretty bad. We also face a much more difficult immediate neighborhood. Smaller neighbors, whether it's Nepal, whether it's Sri Lanka, are quite happy to use India against China, China against India, to get what they can out of both. I would do the same in their place. I mean, you can't blame them for this. But the point is that today, that whole competition or that game has reached a much higher level. Now, this works sometimes against us, sometimes for us. If you look at Colombo Port, Colombo 5-6, the expansions, the new wharves, all built by China with Chinese money, operated by China. But 83% of what goes through that port is to or from India. It's actually transshipment for India. Why? Because our own ports are inefficient and don't have the capacity. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? You can say, isn't this terrible? The Chinese have a stranglehold on trade into India. But you can also say, look, they've spent the money, they build the infrastructure, we get the use of it for free. What's wrong with that? I mean, it depends on how you look at it. As long as it's open, transparent, non-military, doesn't involve security, I don't see a problem, frankly. But that is not arguable about Gwadar, which has no commercial justification as a port. It doesn't make money, which is why Singapore, who used to run it, got out of it and the Chinese took over. And when you look at some of those Belt and Road projects, none of them seem really to have geopolitical rather than any economic justification. And that's where the problem starts, where we rub up against each other. We also have a much broader problem, which is that the world economy is fragmenting. After the crash, after 2008, recovery has been really slow. In fact, you can't even talk of recovery elsewhere outside the US, which probably did the best job of it. And right now, and since then, the wave of protectionism has grown. So you have a slowing, closing global economy, where people are now concentrating on local, regional trading blocks, whether it's RCEP for Asia, it's now that Trump has thrown away TPP, or whether it's in Latin America with Mercosur and the others, or the Europeans also closing their borders to others too, because they want to recover their economies, create jobs, they feel and in a sense, it's the sort of backlash against globalization that, especially in the advanced countries, not so much in China or India, because we are actually the biggest beneficiaries of those 2 decades of globalization before the 2008 crisis. You look at us, 30 years of 6% plus growth, Chinese 30 years of almost 10% growth. So it really is, for us, globalization worked well, but as you can see, and the consequence of that sense that globalization worked against them, that they lost jobs, that manufacturing has deserted the developed countries, is what you see in Trump, what you see in Britain with Brexit, the sort of political incompetence that both Cameron and May showed in actually calling those elections and referendums. But it's more than that. It's more than just a developed country phenomenon reaction to growth. If you look at it, this trend of authoritarian centralizing leaders, since 2012, actually probably you could say started with Abe, Xi Jinping, Modi, and then as you go west, Erdogan, Putin, of course, showed his colors really after the 2009 election, and so on. So it's really the West, in a sense, catching up with Asia. I mean, it's our model, in a sense. But why is this? It's because, and it's a paradox, the state has today diminishing capacity to deliver high growth, because after 2008, the global economy isn't supporting the kinds of figures that you have. So either people cook the figures, or, you know, they say we have to settle for much less. We have to, I mean, you look at the Chinese, they've lowered all their targets. And they say 6.9 is a wonderful growth rate. But, so diminished state capacity. So what happens? Political leaders start promising more, much more than actually they can actually deliver. And you get this peculiar situation where, because they have legitimacy problems, because you look at the Chinese as an example, legitimacy in the 50s, 60s was ideological. We're going to build a communist society. Socialism today, communism tomorrow. Great proletarian cultural revolution wiped out whatever legitimacy that had, that myth. So it became growth. Deng Xiaoping said, get rich is glorious. 80s, 90s, it was, are you better off today than you were yesterday? Do you think you'll be better off tomorrow? Yes, yes, fine. This is a fine regime. So they'll put up with the Tiananmen, whatever, but people will go along with it. Suddenly growth rates start dropping. And if you ask most economists today, growth rates in China are somewhere between 3 and 4%. The official figure is 6.9%. We in India changed our base year and the deflator so that we can also show very high growth rates. Anyway, whatever. But so what do you do when your justification that I deliver high growth is no longer as easy, is no longer available to you? And you can't deliver high growth because the world economy is not supporting it. You have an export-led growth model in China. You turn to nationalism. It's the easiest thing. A form of ultra-nationalism where you can drive people's emotions, and that's what you're seeing. You're in an age of ultra-nationalism where, I mean, from my point of view as a diplomat, you know, it's a bad thing because it reduces government's abilities to bargain, to compromise, to make the adjustments that you need to if you want to keep the peace and deal with all these issues. When all these relationships are getting tougher, it actually means you need to actually give and take. But if your legitimacy is ultra-nationalism, your ability to give is actually shrunk. And that, from my point of view, is really worrying. It's a worrying phenomenon, and it's global. You see the kind of extreme rhetoric. I mean, Trump is the extreme when he tweets. But you hear it from everyone. You hear the Chinese rhetoric on Doklam. It's not what they used to say in the past. We got into a similar situation in 1986 in Sundarungchu, in Wangdo. Nobody was yelling and screaming in the media saying, don't forget 62, and we are not the same as 62, and all this kind of stuff in public. Because both sides sat down and we were sitting literally 6 meters away from each other at that time, and we had a whole brigade deployed on the heights around it. But that didn't mean that we let it explode. And that was exactly the period after that, when Rajiv Gandhi visited, when we did the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement, and it took us 9 years to actually disengage in a phased manner. But it didn't explode. Nobody died. Last death on the border was in 1975. So there's very different reactions today. And I don't blame social media or all this, you know, because these are only means. But fundamental problem is, once you've aroused this ultra-nationalism, it becomes much harder to deal with each of these issues. Today, the government of India also, what kind of negotiation can you actually undertake on Doklam when everything is on the front page every day? And you're negotiating not just with the Chinese, but you're actually negotiating with public opinion, with you yourself. Now, government has been very careful in India not to try and arouse. You'll notice, relatively quiet, but look at what the Chinese have done. And by doing that, they've actually made it very difficult for anyone to do it. So what does all this add up to in terms of the situation we're in? We live in an amazing time. I think that's clear. We are better off than ever before. We have the means to solve our problems, and yet people are angrier, unhappier than they've ever been before. And that's also, it's the flip side, I think, of many groups, individuals being empowered. And ICT, I think, makes this possible, actually encourages this. Secondly, the balance of power between states has changed. Because of globalization, because of these rates of growth that I mentioned, and the differential rates of growth. It's interesting, for India, if you think of every metric of hard power, our position relative to other countries in the world has improved vis-a-vis every country in the world in the last 30 years, except China. China is the only country who actually accumulated power faster than we did. Both of us did it faster than Britain did at the height of the Industrial Revolution, when she grew by 3.7%, that's all. But forget the past. And part of our problem, our psychological problem, is exactly this. We feel good about ourselves, except with the Chinese. And I think we have a problem in dealing with that. But the Chinese also can't stand the thought that we're getting away with standing up to them, and that we think we're equal, and what is this? And we're the only ones who didn't go to the Belt and Road Forum. The rest of the world came and said, oh, what a wonderful idea, you're doing great things, and how do we make money out of this? And you're the only one who didn't. So I think that also, you have this problem, but the balance of power has shifted. You now have a situation, when you look at the globe as a whole, where economic power is really multipolar. It's much more evenly distributed in the world. It doesn't matter whether you look at the financials, you look at actual output, you look at who determines markets, commodity markets and so on. Power is evenly distributed. So it's a multipolar economic world. But political, hard power, military power, and soft power are still dominated by the US to an extent which may be less than immediately after World War II, but there is almost no chance actually of China catching up with most of these. It's very, very difficult for her. So you have this mismatch between the politics of the world, where there is an old order still in place, and you have a new economic order, which actually doesn't fit. The economy, therefore, is fragmenting, the global economy, the old globalized economy. If you look at global value chains or manufacturing chains, both China and the US have been onshoring manufacturing steadily since 2008. In fact, some of it started even before that. You just look at value added in exports or in production, in selected, and you notice how that, when China started reform, by the mid-80s, I think 86, the Chinese value added in China's exports to the world was around 2.5 to 5% average. It was very, very low. Now it's around 44%, which means China does much more of it. It no longer just takes some Nike sole from Thailand and something else, stitches it together and sends it to the US. So if you look at it, both the US and China are onshoring, different ends of the chain. US is onshoring at the higher end of the chain, whether it's digital manufacturing, you look at, whereas China is moving into electronics, and is still to work her way up that chain. But she has actually eliminated a lot of, so Southeast Asia and so on actually are being hollowed out in a sense. And thirdly, there's no global overarching institutions anymore. You look at the state of the UN or its ability to deal with anything. You look at, there are no regional institutions either that deal with security, and there's contention in the commons, whether it's the high seas, you can see South China Sea, East China Sea, wherever you look. You look at outer space, it's being weaponized. Look at cyberspace, and look at the contention in cyberspace. And there's no laws, rules, nothing for that today. So you don't have the institutional systems, you have a balance of power problem, transition, but you don't know to what. And you also have a situation where government's ability to cope with this is much less than. So what what matters for India out of all this? I mean, this big mishmash which is enough to frighten anyone. You know, just to take a step back, what's the goal of Indian foreign policy? It's a very simple one, to enable the transformation of India. Enable. So what does that mean? It means we need to do what we can to create a positive external environment within which we can transform India. And that's going to be the goal for a long time. We have too many poor, illiterate, sick. You know, I mean, there's just too much work to be done to make India a secure, a prosperous, a modern country. I mean, and that's going to be our job for a long time. It's not glory, it's not, you know, and this is why, frankly, I think some things like a UN Security Council seat don't make sense. How much does it add to the well-being of the average Indian? Nothing. And it doesn't, and and you'll actually have to pay costs to get there. So, I mean, but for me, this is the one single criteria that you need to apply when you start saying, is this good? Does this matter? Is it worth putting effort into this? How do we create an enabling environment? And how do we compensate for what India lacks? I mean, there are some things that, whether it's non-ferrous, it's just our resource endowment, non-ferrous metals, energy. There are things that we need the rest of the world for. Look at history. India's always done best when she's most connected to the rest of the world. Whether you talk of the Mauryas, you talk of the Guptas, you look at Harsha's time, you come through the Mughals, you come to the British. The years when you did best were when you were most connected, when you start getting cut off from the rest of the world, because you're on the crossroads of the world. It's your location, maritime, you have a huge advantage. So now, judged by that criteria, what matters? I would say China matters tremendously, because China affects global markets, China will affect the world that you operate in, and what you do, a lot of what you do will be either constrained or helped by what China does. Pakistan doesn't. Even if tomorrow Pakistan, by some miracle, had a complete change of heart and you settled everything with Pakistan, how much would it add to your GDP, to Indian well-being? I mean, you know, you have to ask yourself these questions and decide where to put your effort. And so what does matter to us, let's say in the next 5 years or so, short term, can be summarized as, because it's going to be a low growth, closing global economy, we need to make sure, and I'll go through the list of what we do. Because you have the rise of a pushy, assertive China, you have this return of geopolitics, as I said, contention in the high seas, contention in cyberspace, the state of our immediate neighborhood, which affects you directly, because you look at whether it's language, ethnicity, religion, everything, our borders, frankly, have no real limits. I mean, all these cross every border. What we call mesos on our side, our chin on the other side. I mean, every one of our borders is like this, whether it's with Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, whoever. And most important also, I think, future US behavior as a power in the world, because there's a big question mark about this. So I'm only listing the international issues. I'm assuming that we'll run our own country brilliantly as usual. We will do all the things we should. But you have to remember that you cannot have a successful foreign and security policy if you're posturing, if you're internally polarized, or if you're losing economic momentum at home. I mean, the world just won't be as responsive as it would be otherwise. But in the longer term, beyond 5 years or so, what's going to really determine our future and what will matter for us is things like technological developments. And that's something that not just ICT, artificial intelligence, but also, you know, genetics. I mean, what's happening today. These are things that are going to, in the long term, they will affect, and these matter to you. Energy, where there's a whole revolution going on in the economics of energy, but also in the technologies and climate change, the environment, and demographics, which will make a big difference. For instance, I mean, look at China's demographics. By 2040, China will be as gray as Japan is today. And Japan's the grayest of all the major economies today. which is one reason why China is in such a hurry to push and get her way. If the future was China's, if she was sure history was on her side, why would she be so pushy in the South China Sea, East China Sea, Indo-Clam and other places? Why is she trying to settle things to, why is she trying to build Belt and Road? It'll all happen anyway. She's going to be the biggest economy, why can't she sit back and let it happen? She can't because of her demography, because of the future, and she's not sure that future technologies will work for her. You look at digital manufacturing. It knocks out whatever advantage cheap labor and cheap transport gives India, China, economies like us. So beyond 5 years or so, you have to expect pretty discontinuous and major changes. And obviously, we need to make sure that not only do we stay on top of these things, but we also have a voice in shaping those regimes and issues today. If you don't do it now, you'll never get to it. But that's the longer term. To get there, you have to survive the next 5 years where you have more immediate problems. So what should we do in this situation to deal with these? It seems to me that, we have a changed situation in the last few years, and we need to change our responses. And somebody accused Keynes in a lecture that, you're shifting position on, so he said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? Which is true. The facts have changed around us, and it's time that we also started changing what we do. Because if you keep doing the same old stuff, you actually run the risk of failure. You can't go on dealing with. If the global economy is now multipolar, we need to actually engage much more broadly. You can't sit behind protectionist walls, not participate, be very niggardly in your offers in the RCP and other free trade agreements. It just won't work. Because your prosperity depends now, I told you 49% in 2014 of your GDP depends on external merchandise trade. If China is more assertive in our neighborhood, you need to step up your game and you need to balance China. You need to work with those. If the US is not willing to, work with Japan, with Vietnam, with the others in the periphery, those who also worry about these things. There are other countries, Indonesia. None of them maybe can do what the US used to do, but they can certainly do little bits and pieces. And you need to work to restore balance. Integrate the neighborhood. Work with the neighbors. They are more than ready to work with you. But you've been very slow in the way you've actually implemented projects and integrated them, all the way from Iran to Myanmar. I mean, whether it's Chabahar, all these, Kyokpo and so on. And with China, you need to try to evolve a new modus vivendi, where you sit down and talk through your core interests, see whether either you can deal with them, if you can't deal with them, how do you manage them? And how do you prevent being distracted from your major task, which is at home, transforming your own economy. You can use all these security dilemmas that exist around China, and we need to work to make sure that the global commons stay open. Because for a country like us, that's important. Access to energy, to commodities, to raw materials, to markets, these are things that are going to determine whether you can survive the next few years of political turmoil around you in the world. So for me, this is a time to concentrate on our internal build-up, to cut our external ambitions to fit our power, and concentrating on actually being much more active in the immediate neighborhood rather than on big power diplomacy, and no strutting and preening and claiming things that, we like to do. And I think actually caution is a virtue at a time of great uncertainty like this. And most of all, we need to preserve our strategic autonomy, because that's what's actually got us through most things so far. I'll stop there and maybe leave it open to questions. Shall I sit there?
Okay, can we have a show of hands who all would like to ask questions? So should we collect questions or would you prefer to go one by one? Okay, let's decide based.
First of all, a big thank you to Navish for getting me here.
I should have mentioned that. I couldn't say no to him.
Absolutely. I am Professor Satyakiran. I'm a University Professor at Navy Business School and also full-time Professor at Oxford School of Business in Hyderabad. You have very well brought out the economic aspect for the current volatility across the world. I mean, Professor, I like using phrases like VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and development. Yeah, more than 74 crore is that every month for the next 20 years, 1 million youth are going to join the workforce. There aren't jobs, and the globalization seems to be in very big retreat thanks to Donald Trump and his plans. And I remember what Winston Churchill said. He said, the Americans always do the right thing, but only after doing everything else. My question is, given the what effect will that have on India's foreign policy? Because we all know that economic and political uncertainty can certainly have a lot of impact on the foreign policy of any country.
Well, the glory days of globalization are over, and there's no point saying that that's going to come back, or trying even to act as if they will. Forget about the glory days of globalization. What I think we can cope with, if we are sensible, we can cope with a slow growth world, which has actually reverted to historical mean, in terms of growth. And what we need to fight actually is the closing of the world economy, the protectionism which has come actually already in the last 4-5 years. And it's pre-Trump. Trump only, I think, is the most visible expression of that. But there are limits to what Trump will do or mean. I think if you look at the major US corporations, Apple gets 24% of her profits from China. Boeing gets 26%. The list is almost endless. Even, traditional chemical companies, DuPont gets 9% of her profits from China. So all Trump's threats that I'm going to impose, 45% duty on anything from China and all that, he hasn't acted on any of that, because he knows he'll collapse his own economy, his own corporations will kill him if he does that. He can't, there is a level of codependency there, which I think you look at Europe as well, and certainly as long as Germany is leading Europe, I think they understand that their future is tied to the rest of the world. So you can build coalitions on issues that interest you. But it's going to be hard work, and it needs much more engagement than we seem to have actually put into it. We're still arguing about RFTA is good, we can survive without the RCEP, let them go ahead, then we'll see. For me, this is really dangerous thinking. Because as Krishna Menon used to say, it's easy to walk out of a room, it's very hard to walk back into it if you walk out of a meeting. It's especially on trade and so on, because the new rules of trade are actually, and the new standards are being set now for the future. And each one is looking at what suits them. And it's happening in small fields. You look at ultra high voltage transmission lines, which today only the Chinese operate, and they're about to build one across from Anhui to Xinjiang. But because they're the only ones to have actually built it and operated, their standards are becoming global standards. We seem to have decided, no, we'll pick another set of standards. Now, that's really dangerous, because A, you won't get equipment, B, you'll be left at least 3 to 5 years behind, and your needs for power are just going to grow. But there's a whole set of things like this where I think the key for me is an Indian foreign policy which is much more economically driven and directly tied to interests that suit us. What bothers us? As I said, energy. There are commodities, non-ferrous metals and so on. There are things that we need to, and our immediate neighborhood, which includes the whole Indian Ocean region. That, I think, is what we will have to do much more seriously than we've done before. And it's not enough to rely on a global order or a global system or external balancers to actually do any of this for us. The other problem, of course, is that the more uncertain the international political order becomes, the more you will have to do in order to provide security in the immediate neighborhood. But that means working together with people in peacetime so that when trouble comes, you're in a position to do something. We've tried to a small extent to do that in the Indian Ocean, for instance, with Sri Lanka, with Maldives and Mauritius, Seychelles. We need to do the same in the Bay of Bengal with Bangladesh, where you do maritime domain awareness, where you know what's happening in the oceans, and you're in a position then to reach help to people who need it. But we need to get Bangladesh, Myanmar, Malaysia, all of them, Singapore involved, and do the same on the other side as well. But ultimately it's going to be a much tougher world than I think we're used to. And certainly the easy gains that we used to get. And I think we should prepare our own people for it. You know, rather than saying that, oh, we're going to be wonderful, we're going to be number one, we can do this, we can do that. I think we need to actually start telling our own people the truth. People can take the truth. It's not impossible. Whether we'll ever produce 11, 12 million jobs a year, I don't know. That is, as I said, it's not something that actually the rate at which we're producing jobs has slowed down. But the world economy isn't going to solve that problem for us. Certainly not.
Right, so I saw 3 hands. I think Vamsi, Sayan, Satyendra, Turab. So let's start from here.
Good afternoon, sir. I have 2 questions. First is very issue specific. Do you feel that there are barely any fundamental differences between the 2013 Depsang standoff and the present Doklam standoff? And if there are no differences, would you feel that a strategy that was applied to the standoff in 2013 Depsang situation, wouldn't that solve the present Doklam crisis? The second question is in regard to the reviving of the Look East policy. What's your take on the proposition that this has actually brought the northeastern part of India closer to the, closer in the sense of sentiment emotionally? Yeah, to India, towards India. Yes, sir.
Well, on Doklam and Depsang, you know, it's too early to say about Doklam, about where it's going, because it's obviously different from Depsang 2013 in terms of what the Chinese are saying, the fuss they're making, and in Depsang we were able to, you know, tell them quite clearly that A, your PM is no longer welcome if you go on sitting here, and B, we had also simultaneously moved force and made it clear that there would be consequences if this went on for too long, and that it wasn't necessarily in China's favor. This time the Chinese went public and went ballistic, but we had kept Depsang quiet, and they had also kept it quiet. And I think they did Depsang to remind us that, look, we can get into trouble, we need to actually move forward. This time that doesn't seem to be their goal, because they wouldn't have, you know, said all these things in public, pushed us so hard in public, have the PLA spokesman, the MFA spokesman making statements. In fact, for me, this is an example of, if the Chinese don't want to push us into the American arms, if the Chinese don't want to alienate India for the future, then they're going about it exactly the wrong way. So the only thing that makes sense is if they want to split you from Bhutan. They want to convince Bhutan that you can't rely on India for your security. Come and talk to us, deal with us, and we'll take care of it. That's the only thing that makes, which is exactly the reason why you can't back down either. I mean, you can't destroy your own credibility. So I think it's too early to say where this ends, because it's very hard to predict where it goes unless you know what his goals are, what your goals are, and how you can, if there is some overlap in that Venn diagram, then you work on that. But otherwise, it's very difficult to say. So I'd be a little careful right now saying, you know, it's different. Look East, you know, Look East now, Act East, it's served a huge purpose actually. If you look at trade with ASEAN, you look at our defense, intelligence, security links with them, how efficiently as a result We dealt with piracy off Malacca with Singapore and the others, Indonesia, Malaysia, and originally Thailand. So it has served a big purpose. And also in our counterterrorism work, you know, we've had huge crises which don't hit the headlines. You think of not just Myanmar, but you think of the Andaman Sea, all those refugees in coming not just to the Andamans, but throughout in Thailand and so on. And we've managed to work with most of them because of Look East, because we have a history of working together at various levels, whether it's our militaries, whether it's our civilian bureaucracies, and whether it's and the governments themselves. So for me, Look East has been a big success. Ideally, you should do more. And I think you've now got to the stage where you need to make some basic decisions about the levels to which you're willing to open up your economy to Southeast Asia. The fear in India is always you open to Southeast Asia, you're actually opening to China, you'll get swamped, you'll get killed. Because it's true, they all have free trade access with China. But you know, so you're not going to trade with anybody who trades with China? I mean, that's not a reasonable solution. But you need to now actually kick Look East one whole notch up. And I'm not sure we have the stomach for it. I also am not sure that we're in the right political cycle. As you start approaching a general election, your ability to start doing new things, bigger things, actually declines. In fact, if you look at the history of it, you've done all the best stuff that you've done mostly in the first year of a government when it's brand new. So it's difficult to see whether you will actually do it. But I hope you do, because you need to.
Good afternoon, sir. This is Sharon from the second year. I had two questions with regard to the One Belt, One Road project. First question is with regards to India's decision to not participate in the One Belt, One Road negotiations. So considering costs and benefits of the entire scheme, like India is probably the only country which has huge territorial issues with the One Belt, One Road in the Asian region. Considering the same and also economic losses which might result out of not participating in the negotiation, what do you think should be a justification of India's stance or not a justification? That's the first question. And the second question is regards to, so you said the major revival of the Silk Route majorly has geopolitical effects rather than economic effects. So what do you think India's role should be as a stakeholder to counter the geopolitical expansion of Chinese influence in the Asian region?
Well, about participation in the forum, you know, the interesting thing is there is no one instrument which you sign to join One Belt, One Road. There's no organization even. They didn't even, I thought actually at the forum, they'd set up some kind of international advisory committee, something, you know, something to claim that everybody's on board and everybody, they didn't even do that. So it's actually a series of bilateral agreements and project agreements which are negotiated separately with each recipient. Now, of course, that works to China's advantage, because all her weight she can bring to bear on each negotiation. So there really isn't a Belt and Road initiative to join. We decided not to go to one meeting. Okay, so we didn't go to the meeting. My own preference as an attitude to Belt and Road is look at each bit, each project, each thing, and see whether it suits your interest or not. Whether it makes economic sense, whether it contributes to your well-being in any way. If it does, use it, get involved, see. But as a general principle, it has to be open, it has to be, you know, inclusive, it can't be just something designed like, you look at the power plants in Pakistan. Pakistan wanted to also go to the ADB for funding. Chinese said, no, you'll take it all from us or nothing, or you won't get. Which is why, if you look at that, now they say $72 billion CPEC. Out of that, it's really all the strategic bits that have been implemented, whether it's Gwadar, whether it's, you know, the roads leading to Gwadar and so on. None of the power projects, which is about $34 billion, nothing has even started, because they're still arguing about the terms on which they'll be built and the loans and so on. I am, in the longer run, a little more sanguine than most Indian commentators, because it's like, look at Hambantota. Many of these projects make no economic sense. Now, Hambantota was built with a Chinese loan. The Sri Lankans said we can't pay it back because nobody is using the port. So the Chinese said, okay, convert the debt into equity. So the Chinese now own the port. So we're all horrified, saying terrible. But a dub is a dub is a dub, whether you own it or whether they owe you money for it. It's still a dub. Now that's where the risk comes for you, because after 2 years, he owns this port, it's not making him any money. How does he justify it? He says PLA will use it. So the temptation for him to actually put it to military and other uses is much greater if it's a dud. And that's where I think you need to work beforehand so that your friends don't end up in these positions, like with the Sri Lankans, with the others. So there are things like that. So I would actually go project by project and see which one hurts you, which doesn't, and how you're going to deal with it. Where it works for you, as I said, like Colombo Port, use it. I mean, but I wouldn't have one rule that applies to everything. That would be what I would do. But, we have, so really that's the geopolitics of it. The bits that don't make money are clearly meant for geopolitical. But, there's a limit to how long any power can sustain, can go on sustaining losses and continue investing just for geopolitical reasons, to show the presence, to show the flag. All the successful ones, whether it was the British Empire, whether it's the US at the height of what she was doing, made other people pay for what she did. And they seldom did this kind of thing, where you own a port, it makes no money, and then you keep it going, and okay, so even if your PLA Navy uses it, and that causes us distress, but it's still a cost. And there's a limit, I think, in any system to that. So I'm not sure where this is going. I would expect that parts of this BRI, this grand plan, parts which make economic sense will happen. Some parts of the geopolitical bits will happen, but I would be amazed if they even manage to implement 50% of what they're talking about now in the long run. Because, most of the people who went to the forum are people who thought, we're getting something for free, let's go. But that's clearly not what's happening in the actual negotiation, as I said, with the Pakistani power plants, with the others.
Hello sir, this is Satyan from 5th year. Sir, this is very student perspective kind of question. Like when we compare the budget on education and the defense budget, so like in 2013 to 2014 we had like around more than 10,000 crore allotted to education, and now it is less than it's around 4,900 something or 600. So, and when we compare it to defense budget, which is current immediately allocated around 3,60,000 or 70, 80 around lakh crore rupees. So how you see as someone who was there as National Security Advisor? And second, sir, changing the scenario of cyber insecurity, which you touched upon your talk. China invests a lot. We have read articles, like I have read articles where I've read like there is a team, like many, they are investing a lot in cybersecurity, but in India we don't have anything as such. Like numbers are very, I don't know whether it's correct, but we don't have a proper formal team apart from CDEC or something.
Well, it's not true that we have nothing, but the problem is that nobody will talk about it. And nobody will tell you what they have, because once they say it, then it's no use. So, and besides, it's an area that keeps changing. But to answer your first question about defense, the education budget, I think the government's explanation is that a lot of that money now goes directly to states, that Planning Commission no longer allocates, so therefore the budget, now actually the money goes straight to the states, it doesn't figure in the central budget, this is why. But the fact is that allocations have been cut tremendously, and it's nowhere near enough. But defense budget also has actually shrunk in real terms. If you look at it as a proportion of GDP, it's actually gone down from 2.1 over the last 10 years. It's gone down from 2.1% of GDP to about 1.7%. If you look at it as a proportion of government spending, also it has gone, of the budget itself, also it has declined, but that's only in the last 3-4 years, I think, that it's actually declined. So you're in a situation of tight money where everybody is grumbling, and in government. And the way government works is, you know, it's not a rational allocation of resources saying this is the one that's going to determine my future, therefore I need to invest more. And everyone will say it, but when we look at the actual budget, there is so much carryover from the past in terms of committed expenditure on defense, that actual money for anything new, especially on the capital account in defense, is really a pittance. I mean, there is no real discretion in the defense budget left. And especially once you've done OROP and this and that and made all these promises, frankly, most of your money goes in wages, salaries, and in expenditure that you've already committed. I mean, when you commit to buying, say, Rafale, no matter what the numbers, that's expenditure over the next 20 years. And you're committed. Once you're on that, there's no getting off that. So if you look at the defense figures, there isn't really much room. So where do they go? They go to places like education, where you can actually fiddle with the numbers, and then offer an explanation saying go private, go here, go there, find other ways of making money. And, you know, so it's just the way government works, and it's not unique to us. It happens everywhere. It happens because of, on cyber, you know, we've been working on cyber actually since the turn of the century. I mean, that's when the NSCS was set up, when the National Security Council was set up. One of its first jobs was to actually do cyber. By 2012-13, we had a national cyber security framework in place, a policy in place. DIT actually it announced a policy, but that's only for the public part of what. The rest of it was actually done by the Cabinet Security Committee on Security and is run by the National Security Council. And that part they don't announce about what we do, what kinds of... It's true, we still need to do much more to defend critical cyber infrastructure, I mean, which is a function which NTRO has under the Act. And they've set up a separate body to do that. It now existed for 5 years. But their attempt, you can't protect everything, so their attempt is to start with the most sensitive, harden those, and then try and work your way out. And then to work with individual certs in sectors, like say banking, or with insurance, or with, you know, railways, each of them, and to try and see what they can do to help them. But there's no such thing as 100% cybersecurity, especially not in these kinds of fields, which are exposed to everybody else. But we do have a framework, we do have a certain capability, and you know, there are actually, in India, every year we have conferences of ethical hackers, you name it, everything goes on. We're still one of the major sources of some kinds of viruses in the world, so you can be proud of that if you want to be. But there are, so I wouldn't underestimate us, but we are not, nobody can claim to be secure, and I don't think we ever will be. I have always argued that the goal in cybersecurity has to be two things, has to be resilience. And you have to assume you'll be attacked, you must know you will, and somebody or the other will get through, but you need to be able to come back after that as quickly as possible, with as little damage as possible. So, I mean, there are ways of design, of whatever, hardware, software, different ways of doing that. And the other goal must be that you must develop deterrence of your own. This is nothing to do with the law and with the administrative framework and so on, but people should know that you can do things. So you need to do a little demonstration every once in a while quietly and those are, if you can do those two, then you can complement what you're doing. But there is no such thing as 100%, I mean, that unfortunately. But there is stuff going on, don't worry.
Okay, since we have limited time, can we just collect questions? Because I saw at least 4 or 5 people with their hands up. So the gentleman there, please go first, then Shubham, then we have Turab here, Hardik here, Sarla there, and Arpan.
Big collection.
No, please ask your question straight away.
Shivshanker Menon, thank you for your time.
So you just mentioned about the export-related economic development which India is going to go ahead with.
I didn't say. I said you can't do export-led growth anymore in this slow-growth global economy.
Yeah, but the export-related model is what we are pushing at.
No, we don't anymore. In fact, it's gone down since 49%. It's actually declining now, and we can't. It would be madness to try export-led growth when the world economy is slowing, is getting more protectionist.
So my question was more on the freedom of navigation in the seas. Now we have a Chinese military base at the Djibouti, and the human data, like you just mentioned, what is stopping PLA from coming there? And then you have the Kwaikyou Islands where Myanmar, the Chinese reclamation there, and then the South China Sea. So if you see, the only navy which can counter the Indian Navy in the Asian region is the Chinese. So how effective can we be in ensuring the freedom of navigation in these sea lanes?
There's a very good article yesterday in Foreign Policy magazine by Holmes, James Holmes. He teaches in Naval War College in the US, which says why, if you just went by the numbers, obviously China has the maritime weight. I mean, she has 5 times as many destroyers, frigates, this, that, and the other, submarines 73 to R-21, and so on. But why in actual terms, in terms of maritime security, India is not badly off at all. And it's worth looking at, because there's much more to this calculation than just who has more ships, more. He has other jobs to do also. Secondly, it's how you use your equipment and what you're using it for. Thirdly, you have a geographical advantage, and so on and so forth. I mean, it goes through a long thing. The point is, it makes no sense from the Chinese or your point of view to actually get involved in conflict. It makes sense sometimes to threaten, to get your way. But it's best to get your way without actually having to, because conflict is always unpredictable. It doesn't matter who, what numbers you have, and so on. And especially in maritime and this kind of thing. So don't forget, everything that he puts up long distance away from home, he has exterior lines of communication. For you, this is all interior lines. You are much closer, you can bring force to bear much quicker. Every base he builds is also a target. And from his point of view, actually, each one then has to be defended. It's a whole effort. So there are people in China itself who are raising questions about this kind of strategy, this Farsi strategy that Xi Jinping announced in 2015 April. There are many people within the PLA itself who say, what's this? Why are we doing this? Does it really translate into? Let's see. I think the problem is that their thinking has been so Americanized that if you look at PLA reform and so on, they've just swallowed whole chunks of doctrine and behavior.
So just a procedural matter, since most people appear to be in a rush to leave, can we just have the questions, and then maybe Dr. Menon is here for some time, so then you can engage with him directly, right?
Sir, good afternoon, sir. My question is that, sir, India has long been supported by Russia in various ways, mainly militarily. So now with Russia's changed role, do you think that the relation still has some bearing?
Okay.
Can you just have the other comment, and then you can speak to directly?
Sir, my question is with respect to the policy of India in Tibet. So it's all started because of Tibet with India and China. So don't you think that what Pakistan is doing in Kashmir and what we are doing in Balochistan, same need to be done in Tibet also? We can play hell into Tibet and bring Chinese on their knees.
In 2015, India's Foreign Secretary, Mr. Shivshanker, was sent to Nepal in order to caution the Nepali government not to promulgate the constitution. However, despite such caution from the Indian government, Nepal went forward and put the constitution in effect. So consequently, an informal economic blockade was imposed. The foreign sources from India vehemently denied the economic blockade. However, the evidence on the ground clearly showed that the blockade was in place. And around that, scholarly opinion was in place that fueling the secessionist movement that is there in the southern border of Nepal, southern part of Nepal, the Middle Sea belt, has clear benefit to India if it
furthers and contributes in expanding the Siliguri corridor. So what do you aim for from such policies in the foreign environment of India and in its relation with its South Asian counterparts and neighbors? Thank you.
The disparity between Chinese ambitions of hard power and the kind of soft power they do wield. I was wondering, because the Chinese internal political mechanism is something that a lot of Chinese students and scholars do sort of tend to go criticize, especially once they're in schools and universities abroad in the West. Doesn't that sort of contribute or weaken the Chinese legitimacy claims that they might have in international relations? Because doesn't that serve contrary to their own interests? Because while they might accommodate a lot of hard power, in their everyday interactions, their sort of cultural diplomacy and soft power gains are the kinds of things that might, hold them in good stead, which is a counterproductive model possible.
Thank you, sir. So my question is in reference to your points about nationalism. So if you look at the United States or India, at least in my opinion, more than Modi or Trump, it's more about an ideology. And an ideology where one of our largest problems is a lack of engagement. So where you have a division of a group of people who, for a number of reasons, whether it's personal or economic experiences, differ from, say, a lot of what we were talking about today, and choose to identify more with nationalist views because it aligns more to their goals, in their opinion. So my question is sort of two-part. Number one, how do we create a form of engagement where we're actually inclusive and we're engaging with all individuals across the spectrum, including individuals who do identify more with patriotism and nationalism for whatever reasons? And two, is there a way for us to include a healthy amount of nationalism in aligning it with economic goals and economic progress in such a way where we're not excluding people and we're still using sort of those ideologies to develop and progress further as opposed to pull us down and exclude compromises and solutions, as you earlier pointed out? Thank you.
Okay, so those who want to engage further can stay back. The others are free to leave. We don't want to detain you, if that's the impression being conveyed. And we'll continue the conversation with those who are interested.
Thanks. So should I just run through these quickly? For Russia is still essential. Well, on Russia, I think Russia is essential, still for many reasons. Not only because of what we do in the defense area, which is huge, and we do things with Russia which we can't do with anybody else. But also because Russia has this very sort of uneasy relationship with China, and on most of the issues in the region, at least, Russia does work with us. She comes, so it's not right to say that the relationship is useless from our point of view, but it's also useful to the Russians. They find it, which is why they're still putting such an effort into the relationship. Today, they are now willing to start manufacturing things in India, Kamov helicopters and so on, for instance, which very few other people are. The Defense Technology Initiative with the US has actually run aground. So, for me, that's an important relationship, both for geopolitical balance and for the content, the strategic content of the relationship. On Nepal, my own view is we should never have gotten to a position where you have to say in public, when they've already passed it, oh, change this, do that. There shows some failure of policy. If you've already reached that, it's too late. Clearly, I think we need to do some kind of reset with Nepal, with other smaller neighbors. This is not a good situation to be in. And this kind of, that you do a blockade, you claim you're not doing, everybody can see through all this. It's not, and coercive diplomacy is actually one of the least successful forms. If you look at it throughout history, it's not something that, and I think with Nepal at least, we have so many other links, so many other ways of actually getting our way, of persuading, of making sure that things that are bad from our interest point of view don't happen, that this kind of thing we shouldn't be reduced to. I mean, it shows a certain lack of ability, actually, on our part. And I must confess, I was a bit ashamed by that. About China's hard and soft power, I was, I need to qualify what I said about China's soft power. If you look at China in history, and the Chinese self-image also, but it's also a fact, for most of history, China has been a net technology of science to the world. And she has combined that with a very authoritarian, very, actually a very tight political system of her own. But even at times when she is in internal chaos, during the Sung, when 1/3 of the country was under the Sung dynasty itself, he was still a net provider of knowledge to the world. And that role, I think she's going to do relatively quickly. I actually think that will happen quickly. Doesn't mean the Chinese culture is attractive abroad, or it's not like Coca-Cola, hamburgers, and or music. And the Chinese never have wanted to do that. They don't want to be loved. I mean, they've always thought that foreigners are foreigners, and they're different. They learn Chinese good, at least we can talk to them and we can influence them. But more than that, they've traditionally also, they haven't gone out spreading their culture. They haven't been a proselytizing nation at all. In fact, if you read Confucius, he says, if you do the right thing, other people will imitate you. So he expects you to actually learn from his example and to respect him and say, oh, how wonderful he is. It's a very different attitude to soft power from what, so I don't think you should measure them by the same standards that we measure, say, the US or the others. Yeah, they'll do it differently. But I wouldn't be, people keep saying, oh, as long as they're a totalitarian system, they will never manage to influence other people and so on. But they'll use trade, they'll use technology, they'll use these kinds of things to actually get their way where they can. Whether they'll succeed or not, I don't know. Because as I said, this is a gamble, and they're in a hurry. They're trying to do it quickly. And there will be reactions from other people in this. About nationalism and ideology, this is the hard one. I mean, how do you create an inclusive... For me, the line is, de Gaulle said once, that patriotism is when you love your own people above all others. Nationalism is when you hate all other people except your own. And I think there's a distinction there. Patriotism for me makes sense in that, in that definition. Nationalism, if it's negative, if it's only shown up by doing other people down, actually it makes you a less efficient actor on the international stage. And it provokes reactions, other people are not going to listen to you, you actually have much less influence and much less ability to create outcomes if you display that kind of nationalism. And that's what I think Trump, Xi Jinping, some of them display today. Abe doesn't. I mean, there is a distinction between nationalism, patriotism there, which I think is important. And my worry is that I think we've always been patriotic in India. I mean, that I think goes without saying. But I think we're now shading into nationalism. And that frightens me because I think it says something rather sad about ourselves. More than, forget about whether it works or not and where but it says something, which is what really is my worry. But I have no answer when you say, so what do we do? How do we? I wish I knew. I think the most important, we have to talk about these things among ourselves, tell each other. I mean, what else can we do? It's important because we need to be self-conscious. What's happening is we're losing the ability to look at ourselves in a mirror and say, what are we doing? What are we becoming? Where are we going? I mean, I wonder how many Indians at the end of the day say, what did I do today? How was it? I don't know. Not very many, I think. Yeah. But it's important that as a nation you're more self-conscious of what you are, what you're becoming, how you're behaving, how you appear to other people. I mean, I was telling somebody the other day that like with the Nepalese. Every Indian, when he sees a Nepalese and so on, he instinctively says, oh, you're just like us. And he means to be friendly. It's not, to the Nepalese, this is a threat. You're about to swallow him up. You wiped out his identity. You said you're just like us. So, and we're not at all sensitive to this. We don't even realize the effect of what we've done. And we do it in the most friendly way. Aap to bilkul hum jaise hain. But that's not, it sounds so different to him and to you. That kind of self-awareness. If you're going to deal with people who are different, who come from different backgrounds, you're dealing with the rest of the world. They are foreigners, don't forget. They don't think like you. But we forget that. And unfortunately, this whole enlightenment idea of, rational man is the same interests across, it's all very useful for science, to create a discipline to do economics, but it's not true. People are different, people perceive things differently, react differently also, and that's the one thing that I think that's my long answer to say I don't know.
Right, so on behalf of the school, I thank you for taking out the time and making this trip and spending the day with us. Mr. Menon, so I'm not conferring an honorary doctorate now. Mr. Menon is here till about 5, after which he'll obviously head off to the airport. So those people who don't have class, if you want to have a discussion with him informally after lunch, he will be in the convention center, and I think Lovish will be the point of contact. So if you want to have a discussion in the afternoon, you can contact Lovish, and then you can go and meet Mr. Menon in the convention center. So thank you so much for your time, and we apologize for the disruption that happened in the middle.